always knew Julian hid something behind those tailored suits, but I never imagined the secret was surgically implanted inside him. When the hospital called at 3:14 in the morning, I thought I was rushing to comfort my grieving daughter. Instead, a blood-soaked surgeon dragged me into a corner, shoved a crimson flash drive into my palm, and whispered that if we did not flee the city in 10 minutes, she would take the fall for a murder. Hello, everyone. Before today's story begins, we'd like to share a quick message. YouTube recently removed our monetization, cutting off our income. If you enjoy this story, we humbly ask for just $1 to help pay our staff so they can make a living and keep creating for you. Thank you for saving us. Now, let's begin the story. My name is Natalie Simpson. I am 46 years old, and I serve as the Chief Executive Officer at Vanguard Horizon Logistics. My life is built entirely on order, precision, and control. I manage global supply chains, track thousands of freight containers across oceans, and predict catastrophic disruptions before they ever have a chance to happen. But there is absolutely no spreadsheet, no algorithm, and no contingency plan for the telephone call I received at 3:14 in the morning. The rain was coming down in absolute sheets, hammering against the heavy glass of my penthouse window like scattered gravel. When the phone shattered the total silence of my bedroom, I already knew the news would be terrible. Good news simply does not call at 3 in the morning. "Is this Natalie Simpson?" the voice on the other end asked. It was a woman. Her tone was flat clinical and entirely devoid of human empathy. "I am calling from Seattle Central Hospital. Your son-in-law Julian has been involved in a catastrophic motor vehicle accident. He is currently being rushed into emergency surgery." I did not breathe. I threw off the heavy duvet, my bare feet hitting the freezing hardwood floor. "Is my daughter with him? Is Chloe there?" I demanded, my throat tight. "Your daughter is currently in the waiting room," the nurse replied. "Please hurry." The drive down Interstate 5 was a horrifying blur of neon streaks and violent slashing windshield wipers. The storm was relentless. The black asphalt slick with standing water reflected the harsh red glow of the traffic lights. My knuckles were bone white on the leather steering wheel. I pushed the engine hard, the speedometer needle climbing steadily, though the heavy dread settling deep in my chest had nothing to do with the dangerous wet roads. It was Julian. Since the very day Chloe married him exactly 2 years ago, a dark knot of cold intuition had taken root in my stomach. Julian was entirely too polished. His smiles were always a fraction of a second too slow, his corporate stories perfectly rehearsed. His expensive designer suits meticulously tailored to mask whatever rot lived underneath. I had tried to warn Chloe. I had tried to tell my beautiful, trusting daughter that men like Julian did not just love. They calculated. But she was utterly blinded by his charm. I swallowed my maternal doubts, played the role of the supportive mother, and watched him infiltrate our lives. Now, driving through the freezing deluge, that dormant dread clawed its way violently up my throat. I abandoned my car near the emergency room entrance and sprinted through the sliding automatic doors. The hospital smelled of harsh chemical bleach and stale black coffee. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sickly pale yellow tint over the desolate waiting area. The silence of the room was heavy and entirely unnatural. Then I saw her. Chloe sat curled in a cheap plastic chair in the far corner. She looked so incredibly small. Her blonde hair was a tangled mess, her expensive designer coat soaked entirely through at the shoulders. She was trembling violently, her eyes wide and completely unfocused. I rushed to her, pulling her tightly into my arms. She felt like solid ice. "Mom!" she gasped, her voice cracking. "Mom, it is so bad. There is so much blood." "I am here, sweetie. I am right here," I whispered, stroking her wet hair. She pulled back abruptly, her tear-streaked face twisting in absolute raw confusion. "He said he was in Portland, Mom. He packed his bags for a 3-day business conference in Portland. Why was he driving on a deserted dirt road in the Seattle suburbs? Why was he here? It makes absolutely no sense." The tight knot in my stomach pulled even tighter. Portland was a 3-hour drive south. If he was in Portland, He had absolutely no business being on a suburban Seattle back road at 2 in the morning. He had lied to her. Again. Before I could formulate a comforting lie to soothe her panic, the heavy double doors of the surgical wing burst open. Dr. Aris Thorne stepped into the waiting room. I knew him well by reputation. He was the chief of trauma surgery, a man widely known for his icy composure and steady hands under extreme pressure. But the man standing before me was not composed. His green surgical scrubs were completely drenched in fresh, bright red blood. He was pale, his skin possessing the horrifying color of old parchment. His eyes darted frantically around the empty waiting room, scanning the dark corners, lingering terrified on the automatic doors leading to the street. He looked absolutely petrified. He looked exactly like a man being actively hunted. Chloe shot up from her chair, her trembling hands clasped together in desperate prayer. Dr. Thorne, is he alive? Please tell me Julian is alive." Dr. Thorne did not look at her. He completely ignored the sobbing wife of his bleeding patient. Instead, his panicked wide gaze locked directly onto me. He took a hesitant, shaking step forward, his bloodied gloved hands twitching erratically at his sides. "Are you the mother?" he asked, his voice a strained, harsh whisper. "Yes, I am Natalie Simpson. I am Chloe's mother," I replied, stepping protectively in front of my daughter. "I cannot discuss the surgical outcome with the spouse in her current state." Dr. Thorne lied smoothly, though the violent tremor in his jaw betrayed his words. "I need the senior family member. There is some highly specific special paperwork that requires your immediate signature. It concerns critical life-saving measures." "Paperwork right now?" I asked, narrowing my eyes at him. "Follow me, immediately." It was not a request. It was an urgent, desperate command. He turned on his heel and strode back toward the surgical wing, not toward the brightly lit front desk, but toward a dark, unmarked administrative corridor off to the left side. I looked back at Chloe, who was weeping heavily into her hands, completely unaware of the bizarre and terrifying interaction that had just occurred. A cold shiver ran violently down my spine. The maternal instinct that had been warning me for 2 years was no longer a quiet whisper. It was a deafening siren. I tightened my coat, took a deep breath, and followed the blood-soaked surgeon directly into the shadows. The corridor was a stark contrast to the sterile brightness of the surgical wing. It was a narrow, windowless hallway lined with stacked cardboard boxes and discarded metal intravenous poles. Dr. Thorne did not stop walking until we reached the very last door on the left. It was an old supply closet, judging by the faded plastic sign. He pushed me inside roughly, his hands shaking so hard I could feel the vibrations through the thick wool of my coat. Before I could even open my mouth to demand an explanation, he slammed the heavy wooden door shut. The sharp metallic clack of the first deadbolt turning echoed like a gunshot in the cramped space. He immediately reached up and threw a second heavier latch. The air in the room was instantly suffocating, smelling strongly of rubbing alcohol and old dust. "Dr. Thorne, what exactly is going on here?" I demanded, keeping my voice low but firm. "Where are the papers I need to sign?" He did not answer me right away. Instead, he reached into the breast pocket of his ruined surgical scrubs. He pulled out a small, rectangular black device, no larger than a deck of playing cards. He pressed a button on its side, and a tiny red light blinked to life, emitting a very faint, high-pitched hum. He pointed it directly toward the dome of the security camera mounted in the upper corner of the ceiling. The green light on the camera instantly flickered and died. "There are no papers," he whispered, his voice trembling so violently it was barely coherent. "I had to get you away from the lobby. I had to get you away from anyone who might be watching." He reached into his lower pocket. When his hand emerged, he lunged forward, grabbing my right wrist with terrifying strength. He pressed something cold, hard, and incredibly slick into the center of my palm, folding my fingers tightly over it. I looked down. My breath caught sharply in my throat. It was a standard metal flash drive, but it was coated entirely in thick, dark crimson blood. The metallic casing was smeared with a sticky, coagulating fluid. It was still warm. The metallic copper smell of fresh blood instantly filled the tiny space between us, making my stomach churn violently. "What is this?" I gasped, instinctively trying to pull my hand away, but his grip was like an iron vice. "Listen to me very carefully, Natalie," Thorne said, his eyes wild, darting toward the locked door as if expecting it to be kicked down at any given second. "Your son-in-law was not in an accident. The police outside will tell you he lost control of his vehicle in the rain. They are lying or they are completely ignorant. The paramedics noted that the steering wheel of his car was locked dead straight and the brakes were completely disengaged. The onboard computer of his sedan was overridden. Someone hacked his vehicle remotely and drove him off that embankment at 80 miles per hour. My mind struggled to process the sheer magnitude of what he was saying. Hacked, but why? And why do you have this? I lifted my fist, the bloody drive burning against my skin. Dr. Thorne swallowed hard, a bead of cold sweat trailing down his pale temple. Because they wanted him dead, but they failed. When we opened his abdomen to repair a massive internal hemorrhage, we found a blockage in his lower stomach. It was not food. It was a thick medical-grade silicone capsule. He had swallowed it intentionally. This drive was sealed inside of it. The horrifying image of Julian swallowing a piece of hardware to hide it flashed through my mind. Whatever was on that drive, it was worth dying for. It was worth killing for. "Why give it to me?" I asked, my voice barely a breath. "Why not give it to the authorities?" "Because the authorities are already compromised," Thorne hissed, leaning in so close I could feel his frantic, shallow breaths. Less than 5 minutes ago, 4 men walked into the emergency room lobby. They are wearing identical black suits. They have 0 identification badges, 0 hospital clearance, and they bypass security like they own the building. They are currently at the front desk demanding we transfer Julian to their custody immediately. They do not care that his chest cavity is still open. They intend to finish what the crash started. Panic, pure and primal, surged through my veins. "Chloe," I breathed out, stepping toward the door. "I have to get my daughter out of that waiting room." Thorne blocked my path, his bloodied hands pressing hard against my shoulders. "You cannot just walk out there. You have to understand what is at stake." When the anesthesia team was putting him under, Julian was fighting the sedatives. He was thrashing on the table, completely delirious. He was bleeding out Natalie, but he kept screaming your name. Not Chloe's name, your name. I froze completely. "What did he say?" "He said tell Natalie to take it. Only Natalie. He kept repeating that if you do not take this drive and get away, they are going to frame Chloe. He said they will make her take the fall for a murder that has not even happened yet. He begged me to find you to save her life." The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the faint hum of the jamming device and the distant muffled sound of a heavy door slamming somewhere down the corridor. My heart hammered aggressively against my ribs. The polished, arrogant Julian I had despised for 2 years had used his final conscious moments to protect my daughter, entrusting his darkest secret to the one person who hated him the most. Thorne grabbed the handle of a secondary exit, a heavy fire door leading to the rear loading docks. He pushed the crash bar, letting in a blast of freezing, rain-soaked air. "Hide that drive," Thorne commanded, his eyes filled with absolute terror. "Put it somewhere they cannot physically pat you down and find it. Do not tell your daughter what you have. Do not trust the nurses, and absolutely do not trust the local police standing by the coffee machines. You need to get Chloe out of this building before those men figure out he no longer has the drive." He shoved me out into the harsh wind. The heavy metal door slammed shut behind me with a sickening thud, the lock clicking firmly into place. I stood alone in the dark, the freezing rain violently washing the warm blood from my hands, leaving only the cold metal drive pressed deeply into my flesh. I stood in the freezing downpour for exactly 10 seconds. I leaned heavily against the rough brick wall of the loading dock, pulled off my left leather boot, and forcefully ripped the glued insole away from the heel. I shoved the bloody metal drive deep into the cavity, pressing the lining back over it. When I forced my foot back inside, the sharp, rigid edge of the metallic casing dug fiercely into the bottom of my soul. It was a perfect, painful physical reminder of the reality I was now carrying. I circled back to the main entrance, keeping my head down and my coat pulled tight against the storm. As I pushed through the revolving glass doors, my eyes immediately locked onto the target. 4 men in immaculate black suits were standing aggressively near the triage desk. They were speaking in low, demanding tones, completely ignoring the frantic protests of the night shift nurses. They moved with the synchronized, lethal precision of a private military contractor. I kept my gaze fixed firmly on the polished linoleum floor and moved swiftly back to the secluded waiting area. Chloe was exactly where I had left her, huddled in the cheap plastic chair, staring blankly at the wall. I knelt beside her, forcing a mask of absolute manufactured calm over my features. "Sweetheart," I said smoothly, touching her knee. "The administration desk needs me to fill out some extensive medical insurance paperwork before they can proceed with his post-operative care. I am going to step away for just a few minutes. Do not move from this chair and do not talk to anyone." I did not wait for her to nod. I walked briskly down the hall and ducked into the women's restroom, locking myself inside the farthest stall. My hands were shaking, but my mind was shifting into an icy, highly familiar state of operational control. In the logistics business, you learn very quickly that every single piece of moving cargo leaves a paper trail. Money is absolutely no different. It moves exactly like freight. You just have to know how to read the digital manifests. As a corporate executive, I always carried a universal data adapter in my handbag. I pulled off my boot, retrieved the drive, wiped the remaining smeared blood on a dry paper towel, and connected it directly to the charging port of my smartphone. The screen illuminated instantly with a prompt. The primary sectors of the drive were heavily encrypted, but there was a secondary partition left completely open and unsecured. Julian knew he might not survive the night. He needed whoever found this to see the truth immediately, without needing a decryption key. I tapped the screen, opening the master directory. My eyes scanned the cascading lines of data. It was not a tragic suicide note. It was a meticulous corporate ledger of organized crime. I opened folder after folder, reading through scanned bank wires, offshore registry documents, and encrypted email chains. The sheer scale of the operation was staggering. They were laundering hundreds of millions of dollars through phantom supply chain contracts and dummy real estate investment funds. Julian's digital signature was stamped on every single fraudulent transaction. But as I cross-referenced the routing numbers with the equity distributions, the underlying architecture of the crime became glaringly obvious. Julian was not the mastermind. He controlled exactly 0% of the actual liquid assets. He was nothing but a highly paid decoy. He was a sacrificial lamb built entirely to take the heat if the federal regulators ever caught the scent. Then my finger hovered over a subfolder labeled with a date from exactly 2 weeks ago. I tapped it and the blood in my veins turned to absolute ice. Inside the folder was a collection of meticulously forged documents. There were fake offshore bank accounts registered entirely under Chloe's name. There were fabricated email correspondences deliberately written to sound like my daughter negotiating with illicit shell companies. There were even fake flight itineraries and forged digital signatures on massive wire transfers. Julian's original master plan was mapped out right in front of me in horrifying detail. He had spent the last 6 months building a watertight coffin for his own wife. He had intended to fake his own death, disappear across the border with a fraction of the stolen money, and leave this perfectly curated trail of fake evidence behind for the authorities to find. He was going to let the Federal Bureau of Investigation tear my daughter's life apart. He was going to let her take the fall as the ultimate mastermind of a global syndicate so he could walk away completely free. Anger flared violently in my chest, hot and blinding. I had to bite the inside of my cheek until I tasted copper to keep from screaming. But as I continued to scroll through the hidden administrator logs, the rage morphed into profound, calculated horror. I needed to know who was actually pulling the strings. Who was the real shadow architect that Julian was so desperately terrified of? I traced the final destination of the laundered money. The capital flowed through a dozen international banks before funneling directly into a single domestic venture capital firm based right here in Seattle. I recognized the corporate tax identification number immediately. My mind furiously connected the dots, visualizing the ownership structure I had seen 100 times at social dinners and charity galas. The venture capital firm belonged to Valerie. Valerie, the brilliant, charismatic woman who had been Chloe's college roommate. Valerie, who had stood at the altar as my daughter's maid of honor. Valerie, who had sat at our dining table drinking my expensive wine, holding my daughter's hand through difficult times. Valerie, who was Julian's silent business partner. It all clicked into place with sickening mathematical clarity. Julian had gotten cold feet or demanded too much of the cut. He had tried to execute his cowardly escape plan, but Valerie had caught him. Valerie was the one who hacked the steering column of his luxury sedan and drove him off a cliff. Valerie was the one who deployed the men in black suits to finish the job at the hospital. She had decided to liquidate her useless, panicking puppet to protect her empire. Suddenly, the bright screen of my phone vibrated violently in my hand. A text message notification dropped down from the top edge. It was from Chloe. I read the words, and the air completely vanished from my lungs. "Mom, where are you?" Valerie just called me. She saw the news about the crash on the local scanners, and she is on her way here right now. She said she is coming to give me a huge hug and help us through this. The predator was not just hunting Julian. She was walking directly into the hospital to secure her backup scapegoat. I yanked the charging cable from my phone, shoved the device deep into my coat pocket, and kicked the heavy wooden door of the restroom stall open. I sprinted down the narrow corridor back toward the main waiting area, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. As I rounded the corner, the breath was instantly and violently punched from my lungs. Valerie was already there. She was standing perfectly poised under the harsh fluorescent lights, not a single strand of her dark hair out of place, despite the raging storm outside. She wore a pristine white trench coat looking exactly like an angel of mercy descending to comfort her grieving best friend. But I knew exactly what she was. She was leaning over Chloe, her face arranged into a mask of deep manufactured sympathy, and she was pressing a large paper cup of steaming coffee directly into my daughter's trembling hands. Dr. Thorne's warning screamed in my mind. Do not trust anyone. A predator does not bring a warm beverage to a hospital at 4 a.m. merely out of the goodness of her heart. That cup was a weapon. It was laced with a heavy chemical sedative designed to make Chloe docile, pliable, and easy to quietly escort out of the building and into the back of a black van. I did not slow down. I did not call out a greeting. I accelerated, closing the distance between us in 3 massive strides. When I was exactly 3 feet away, I intentionally hooked the toe of my heavy leather boot behind my own ankle. I pitched forward, letting my body weight crash violently into Valerie's side. "Oh my God!" I screamed, flailing my arms wildly. My left hand smashed directly into the side of the paper cup just as it touched Chloe's lips. The lid blew off. Boiling brown liquid erupted into the air, splashing across Valerie's pristine white coat and pooling heavily on the cheap linoleum floor. The acrid smell of burnt roast and strong chemical bitterness instantly hit my nose. Valerie let out a sharp, genuine shriek of rage, her carefully crafted mask slipping for a fraction of a second to reveal the cold, calculating murderer underneath. "Mom, what are you doing?" Chloe cried out, jumping back from the steaming puddle. I did not waste a single millisecond apologizing. I grabbed Chloe by the wrist, my fingers digging into her skin with enough force to leave bruises. I hauled her violently out of the plastic chair. "We have to run right now," I hissed directly into her ear, my voice trembling with absolute panic. "There is a man with a gun in the surgical wing. He is shooting people, Chloe. Move your feet." The lie was horrifying, but it was the only thing guaranteed to override her shock and force immediate compliance. The sheer terror of an active shooter completely eclipsed her grief. Chloe gasped, her eyes going wide, and she started running without a single backward glance. Valerie tried to grab my arm as I passed her, her voice dropping the sweet act entirely, but I ripped myself away and shoved her hard against the wall. I dragged Chloe away from the main entrance, aiming directly for the restricted staff corridors. As we crashed through the swinging double doors, I risked a single glance back over my shoulder. Across the lobby, 2 of the men in black suits had witnessed the commotion. They were already sprinting toward us, their hands reaching inside their tailored jackets. "Faster, Chloe!" I screamed, pulling her down a long, dimly lit hallway. The overhead lights here were set to a low night mode, casting long, terrifying shadows against the peeling beige paint. My brain shifted gears, leaving behind the panicked mother and fully engaging the logistics executive. A hospital is nothing more than a complex warehouse. It has intake zones, processing centers, and outflow pipelines. I just needed to read the architecture. I spotted a fire evacuation map bolted to the cinder block wall. I did not stop to study it. I scanned it while running at full speed, my eyes instantly isolating the color-coded utility routes tracing the primary structural arteries away from the public zones. "Take a hard left up ahead," I commanded, my voice flat and authoritative. We careened around the corner, our rubber soles squealing loudly against the polished floor. The heavy synchronized footsteps of our pursuers echoed ominously behind us, growing louder by the second. They were faster than us, and they knew the building better. I needed to break their line of sight. I slammed my shoulder into a heavy metal door marked with the universal yellow symbol for biological hazard. The smell hit us instantly. It was a thick, gagging odor of iodine, rotting organic material, and harsh industrial bleach. We had entered the medical waste processing facility. Massive blue incinerator bins and towering cages of red plastic bags formed a chaotic labyrinth. "Keep your head down and stay exactly behind me," I whispered, weaving aggressively through the narrow gaps between the towering carts. The layout was chaotic, but to me, it was just another disorganized loading dock. I used the towering metal cages to completely obscure our path, zigzagging aggressively toward the faint draft of cold air that indicated an exterior loading bay. Behind us, the heavy door crashed open. "Fan out! Check the incinerator rows!" a deep voice barked. We reached the back wall. There was a massive roll-up door raised about 3 feet off the ground, letting the freezing rain blow violently into the room. We slid under it on our stomachs, scraping our knees on the rough concrete, and tumbled out onto a wide-covered asphalt driveway. Luck, for the first time that entire night, finally favored us. Parked directly in front of the bay was a white commercial box truck used for transporting dirty hospital linens. The engine was rumbling loudly, a thick cloud of white exhaust pluming into the freezing night air. The driver's side door was wide open, the cab completely empty. The driver had clearly just stepped inside to grab a manifest or take a quick restroom break. "Get in the passenger seat and get down on the floorboard," I ordered, practically throwing Chloe into the cab. I scrambled into the driver's seat, slamming the heavy door shut. I threw the gear shift into drive, my foot slamming the accelerator all the way to the floor. The heavy truck lurched forward violently, its dual rear tires spinning wildly on the slick, wet pavement before finally catching traction. As we tore out of the hospital loading dock and merged aggressively onto the dark, rain-swept highway, I glanced in the side mirror. 2 men in black suits had just burst onto the loading dock, their weapons drawn, shrinking into the distance as the storm swallowed us completely. We were out, but the hunt had only just begun. I drove the stolen linen truck for nearly 2 hours, pushing the heavy vehicle deep into the rugged foothills of the Cascade Mountains. The storm began to break, leaving behind a thick freezing fog that clung to the towering pine trees. We abandoned the truck on a forgotten logging road and hiked the remaining half-mile on foot. We arrived at a small, weathered wooden cabin completely hidden off the grid. 5 years ago, I had purchased this property using physical cash and a blind trust. There were no property taxes tied to my name, no utility bills, and absolutely no digital footprint. It was a paranoid investment, at the time a quiet sanctuary from the suffocating pressure of corporate logistics. Tonight, it was our only fortress. Inside, the air was bitter cold and smelled of pine needles and old dust. I locked the heavy deadbolt, pulled the heavy blackout curtain shut, and ignited a small fire in the stone hearth. Chloe sat perfectly still on the edge of the worn canvas sofa. The adrenaline from the hospital escape was finally wearing off, leaving her hollow and violently shaking. I pulled a backup encrypted laptop from a hidden floor safe. I connected the blood-stained flash drive, navigated past the security partitions I had already broken, and turned the screen toward my daughter. "Chloe," I said, my voice gentle but entirely unyielding. "You need to look at this. You need to see exactly who you married, and you need to see exactly who your best friend is." She blinked, her eyes red and exhausted. For the next 45 minutes, I guided her through the darkest corners of her own life. I showed her the fraudulent bank accounts opened in her name. I showed her the forged emails meticulously designed to frame her for a massive federal crime. And finally, I showed her the direct transfer ledgers proving that Valerie, her maid of honor, was the true architect of the entire syndicate. Watching a human being completely shatter is a horrifying experience. Chloe gasped, her hands flying to her mouth as the agonizing weight of the betrayal crushed her chest. She wept with a primal, agonizing intensity. She cried for the husband who had planned to destroy her, and she cried for the best friend who had tried to murder him just to protect her own wealth. I held her tight, letting her bleed out the grief. But as the fire popped and crackled in the silent cabin, the tears eventually stopped. The shock faded. When Chloe finally looked up at me, the shattered, terrified girl was gone. Her eyes were hard, dry, and burning with an absolute freezing rage. She had crossed the threshold. She was no longer a victim. "What do we do now, Mom?" she asked, her voice carrying a dangerous, steely edge that mirrored my own. "Do we call the police? Do we hide here forever?" I closed the laptop with a sharp snap. "No. The people hunting us have too much money and too much influence. If we simply hand this over to the local authorities, Valerie will spin the narrative. She will use her lawyers to bury us, and we will spend the next 10 years looking over our shoulders. In my business, when a competitor tries to launch a hostile takeover, you do not hide. You dismantle them." I connected the laptop to a satellite internet uplink hidden in the roof space. I routed my connection through Vanguard Horizon Logistics' encrypted virtual private network, bouncing the signal across servers in 5 different countries to ensure it was absolutely untraceable. I was stepping back into my element. I was no longer a fleeing mother in a rainstorm. I was a chief executive officer orchestrating a hostile elimination. My first move was surgically precise. I compiled a highly specific data packet containing 70% of the financial ledgers. It was more than enough raw evidence to trigger a massive federal raid on Valerie's venture capital firm, but carefully scrubbed of the forged documents framing my daughter. I drafted an anonymous, untraceable message and transmitted the entire package directly to the secure intake server of the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Financial Crimes Division. The federal agents would need time to verify the data and mobilize. I needed to ensure Valerie was perfectly positioned when they finally brought the hammer down. My second move was the trap. During my initial scan of the drive in the hospital bathroom, I had extracted the encrypted security keys to Julian's private communication channels. I opened his secure email client. I assumed his digital identity. I began to type, matching his arrogant, demanding tone perfectly. "You missed Valerie," I typed. "The crash did not finish the job. I woke up. I slipped out of the hospital before your pathetic hired suits could find my room. I still have the master drive, every single file, every single offshore account. I am leaving the country, but I need travel capital. $5 million in unmarked, non-sequential bills. Bring it to Pier 42 at the abandoned industrial shipping yards. 6 o'clock in the morning. Come alone, or I send the unencrypted drive to every major news outlet on the western seaboard. Do not test me." I hit send. We sat in the dimly lit cabin watching the screen. The trap was set. Now we had to see if the predator would take the bait. Valerie was arrogant, but she was also incredibly desperate. She believed Julian was a coward. She would easily believe he was trying to extort her for one final payout before vanishing completely. Exactly 12 minutes later, the screen illuminated with a new notification. It was a direct reply from Valerie's secure server. 6 o'clock, Pier 42. If you cross me, Julian, I will hunt you to the ends of the earth. A cold, predatory smile crept across my face. Valerie had swallowed the hook completely. She thought she was walking into a desperate negotiation with a dying man. She had absolutely no idea she was stepping onto my chessboard, and in a commercial shipping yard, I was the undisputed king. "Get up, Chloe," I said, grabbing my heavy coat. "We have a meeting at dawn." The fog rolling off the Puget Sound was so incredibly thick at 5 o'clock in the morning that the abandoned industrial shipping yard looked like a desolate graveyard of iron giants. Pier 42 was entirely silent, save for the rhythmic, hollow crashing of the black salt water against the decaying concrete pylons. The air smelled strongly of diesel fumes, old rust, and rotting kelp. I stood perfectly still in the deep shadows of a massive red freight container, my black coat blending seamlessly into the darkness. I was not afraid. The panic that had gripped my chest at the hospital was completely gone, replaced by a freezing, calculated resolve. Headlights violently pierced the dense white fog. A sleek, black luxury sports utility vehicle rolled to a slow, menacing halt exactly in the center of the loading zone I had designated. The heavy doors opened with a synchronized thud. Valerie stepped out onto the damp asphalt. She was no longer wearing her pristine white coat of mourning. She was dressed in a sharp, dark trench coat, looking exactly like the ruthless corporate predator she truly was. Flanking her on either side were two of the identical corporate assassins from the hospital lobby. They moved with lethal efficiency, both gripping heavy tactical rifles equipped with elongated sound suppressors. "Julian!" Valerie called out, her voice dripping with venomous impatience and absolute arrogance. "Bring the drive out right now. I do not have time to play your pathetic little games. The sun is coming up, and my patience is entirely gone." I took a deep, steadying breath, letting the icy marine air fill my lungs, and stepped calmly out from the darkness into the pale pool of the vehicle's headlights. "Julian could not make it to the meeting," I said, my voice echoing sharply off the surrounding steel walls. Valerie froze instantly. The initial shock on her face was deeply satisfying, a momentary crack in her perfect armor, but she quickly masked it with a cruel, mocking laugh. "Natalie, you actually came." I suppose Julian was too much of a bleeding coward to face me himself. Did he send his mother-in-law to do his dirty work? Or did you just wander in here trying to play the hero for your pathetic daughter? Either way, handing over the drive personally is just terribly stupid of you. She casually raised 2 fingers. The armed men immediately raised their rifles, the red laser sights locking directly onto the center of my chest. "You think this is a simple negotiation?" I replied smoothly, not breaking eye contact, slowly raising my right hand from my coat pocket. I was holding a heavy yellow industrial remote control, the exact model used by Doc Foreman to manually override terminal automation. "You think you control this environment simply because you brought expensive guns and hired thugs. But you forgot what I actually do for a living, Valerie. I manage global supply chains. I coordinate the movement of thousands of tons of solid steel every single day. You are not standing in a dark alley. You are standing inside my warehouse." Before the assassins could pull their triggers, I pressed the master execution button. The concrete beneath our feet shook violently. High above us, hidden completely by the dense canopy of fog, the massive automated gantry cranes groaned to life with a deafening mechanical roar. Valerie looked up in absolute paralyzing terror as the shrieks of grinding gears pierced the morning air. 4 colossal 40-foot steel shipping containers plummeted simultaneously from the sky. They slammed into the concrete with an earth-shattering crash, throwing up a massive cloud of dust and water. They formed a perfect, inescapable steel box directly around Valerie, her armed guards, and her vehicle. The precision was flawless. The heavy metal walls interlocked, locking her completely inside a cage of solid, impenetrable iron. Valerie screamed something from inside the trap, but her voice was completely muffled by the sheer thickness of the corrugated steel. Before the dust even began to settle on the wet asphalt, I hit a second toggle switch on the remote. The pier's massive emergency public address system, usually reserved for tsunami warnings, roared to life. A high-definition audio recording echoed thunderously across the entire harbor. It was Valerie's own voice captured from the decrypted secure server logs I had extracted at the cabin. The recording explicitly detailed her order to hack Julian's car, her meticulous plan to frame Chloe with forged financial documents, and the entire architecture of her illegal empire. as her arrogant voice boomed relentlessly over the loudspeakers, confessing her sins to the open ocean. The rusted iron gates of the shipping yard exploded inward. Blinding red and blue tactical lights aggressively fractured the morning fog. Dozens of heavy armored transport vehicles from the Federal Bureau of Investigation swarmed the pier, screeching to a chaotic halt around the steel perimeter I had built. Heavily armed federal agents poured out like a tidal wave, weapons drawn completely surrounding the trapped criminals. I dropped the yellow remote control onto the damp asphalt. I turned my back on the flashing lights and walked away, slipping quietly into the shadows where Chloe was waiting safely in the driver's seat of our vehicle. 6 months later, the dust had finally settled. The entire criminal syndicate collapsed entirely under the crushing weight of the federal investigation. The data packet I had meticulously curated was utterly bulletproof. Valerie and Julian were both convicted on over 50 federal charges, including conspiracy to commit capital murder, massive wire fraud, and international racketeering. They were both handed consecutive life sentences in maximum security, federal penitentiaries, completely stripped of their wealth and without any possibility of parole. I stood alone on the expansive balcony of my penthouse, feeling the warm evening breeze wash over my face. I raised a heavy crystal glass of expensive red wine, taking a slow, deeply satisfying sip. Inside the brightly lit living room, I could hear Chloe laughing warmly, surrounded by genuine friends, slowly and beautifully rebuilding her life. I looked out over the glittering, peaceful city skyline. I was a logistics executive. I was a mother, and I had proven that I was an absolute monster when I needed to be. I smiled softly into the night air, knowing with absolute, unshakable certainty that for the rest of our lives, no one would ever dare touch my daughter again. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. We hope you enjoyed it. As an ad-free channel, your support is what keeps us alive. Please support James Revenge Stories with just $1 via the QR code on the screen or click the link in the description box or pinned comment. Also, we'd love to connect with you. Please leave a comment telling us which city or state you're listening from. Thank you for standing with us, and see you in the next stories.